The message arrived on a Tuesday. The Vtkai Dominion did not have Tuesdays. They counted time in orbital cycles, solar intervals, and a multi-level counter system with 17 levels of precision, none of which corresponded to the standard Earth calendar. But humanity lived by Tuesdays. And so, on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 station time, the most important message in 200 years of human spaceflight appeared in the inbox of Admiral John Ray at Lunar Station 1. She read it at her desk. Cold coffee sat at her elbow, alongside a half-eaten cafeteria sandwich that had seemed optimistic when she started it 3 hours ago. She read it once, then again. Then she laughed a real, deep, full laugh, the kind that doesn't ask for permission before escaping. She was still laughing when Lieutenant Koo, her adjutant, appeared in the doorway with the morning reports. He watched her for a long time. "Admiral, please read this." She slid the tablet across the desk. Koo was 26, precise, and possessed a professional gift for keeping his face calm even when his brain was doing something more complex. He took the tablet, read it, and set it down. "It appears to be a formal declaration of war. They want all 12 colonies and the entire fleet to disarm. 48 hours. She stood and walked to the window. Earth hung in the deep blackness below the station, wide and blue. The coast of Africa was barely visible through the slow drift of clouds. From here, it looked peaceful. It wasn't peaceful. It had never been peaceful for long. Now, she was starting to think that perhaps that was the point. They had specified their fleet size, Ku, right in the body of the message, 4,000 warships. They listed the number as if they expected us to read it and simply stop. "That is a very large number, ma'am." It was. She thought for a moment of her grandfather. Born in Manila, raised on stories of a grandmother who survived 3 different occupations of the same city without ever leaving it. She fed people, hid things, and survived through the specific stubbornness of a person who had decided that this was her place and she wasn't going anywhere. This is the number of a people who have been winning for so long they have forgotten that victory isn't free, that someone has to agree to lose. She turned away from the window. "Bring me General Park. Summon the command council and Ku." "Ma'am?" "New coffee. Whatever is in that pot died during the night shift." The Vtkai Dominion had been the leading military power in this sector of space for 4,200 years. This wasn't a Vtkai observation requiring reflection. It was simply background reality, like gravity or the cold of deep space. They had grown from a single home world into a civilization spanning 600 light-years. They ruled 847 species. They had fought 43 major military campaigns. They had never lost one. Their military doctrine had been honed over 4 millennia to mathematical perfection. Every ship had its role. Every formation was tested by centuries of actual conflict. For every scenario, there was a standard response. The system worked because it always worked. Subcommander Etar had been trying for 3 years to explain why none of this applied to what was about to happen. She was the Dominion's leading expert on human civilization. She had read their recorded history from the very beginning, the early cities, the empires, the collapses, the long periods of recovery, the industrial eras, the centuries when they almost destroyed themselves with weapons capable of ending their planet, and the years after that, when they pulled back from the brink and kept moving. She studied their literature, their philosophy, and spent 6 months doing nothing but reading their military records. After those 6 months, she sat alone in her quarters for 2 days before writing her first assessment. The report was long and carefully reasoned. Its main conclusion was that humanity represented a risk profile that did not exist in the Vtkai Tactical Library, and that the standard annexation process was not designed for this type of species. The assessment was submitted, acknowledged, and mentioned in one sentence of the command briefing. Human military power noted as limited. Fleet size, 63 warships. On the morning after sending the ultimatum, she stood in the command room of Supreme Commander Zevrat and tried once more. "Their fleet is not the problem," she said. "Their fleet is what will oppose our fleet," Zevrat replied. "Their fleet is the problem. Their fleet is what we can see." She opened a historical file. This species has been at war with itself for 10,000 years, not constantly, but they have fought in almost every possible way. They have lost major wars, wars that almost ended their civilization, and they came back. Every single time, they adapted and continued. She changed the display to a specific conflict from their early industrial period, a small island nation against an industrial giant. Any rational analysis would say that nation was finished by the end of the first year. No resources. Allies gone. Cities bombed every night. And yet, they fought for 4 more years and won. She looked him straight in the eyes. I have documented over 1,000 examples of this pattern throughout their history. This species does not perceive the threat of extinction the way other species do. It doesn't mean they are braver. It's just that they have survived so many near-extinction events that some part of them does not accept extinction as a final answer. They have already been here. They know they were here and they survived it. She paused. They will not stop. Supreme Commander. Zevrat studied the files. He was a cautious officer. He sat with it for a minute. They have 63 ships, he said. We have 4,000. At some point, the will to survive collides with the reality that survival is impossible. Atar thought of the 1,000 examples of a species that was hours away from nuclear suicide, pulled back, and built this near-death experience into a specific form of self-knowledge. We were here, and we are still here. Yes, sir, of course, she said. She left the room, not entirely certain she believed it herself. 3 weeks before the ultimatum was sent, an elder of the Orc civilization received an unusual message through an unofficial diplomatic channel she had cultivated for decades. The Orcs were old, older than the Vtkai by 2,000 years, and unlike the Vtkai, they had long ago decided to stop expanding and simply exist. They occupied 12 quiet star systems in the outer arm of the galaxy and observed everything with the patience of those who had seen enough to know what was important. The message stated in simple terms that the Dominion had decided to annex human territories. Elder Sarita read it once. She sat with it for a long time. Then she sent a one-line reply. We advise patience. Study them before you act. The Vtkai did not reply. Sarita noted this in her records and wrote in the section reserved for predictions. Outcome uncertain. Whatever happens here, it will matter. Observe carefully. Her assistant suggested it was merely common caution, elders being wary of the young making youthful mistakes. But Sarita was thinking of something specific, something she had read in human files years ago when she first identified them as a species worth watching. A quality that was hard to classify. Not strength, not intelligence, not raw numbers. A refusal, an unusual refusal. Every species facing a sufficient threat would resist. That was biology. The Vtkai had broken that resistance in 847 species. They did it because, at some point, the resistance calculated that it could not win and accepted the math. The human refusal did not produce such a calculation. When something was taken from them, a deep part of them registered not the impossibility of getting it back, but the sheer wrongness that it had been lost. And that wrongness sat in them, grew, and would not stop growing. The Vtkai had never encountered this. She sent a second message, not of her own initiative, consisting of one line, there is no bottom. The Vtkai did not reply to that either. She closed the file, opened her observation logs, and waited to see what the universe would do with a Tuesday ultimatum. The emergency session of the Terran Council lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes. Ray sat in the back of the room as an observer and saw the full spectrum of positions discussed. Immediate diplomatic engagement, firm rejection, demands for more time, and one proposal for counteroffers, which was quickly dismissed. In the end, it came down to what it always came down to, who we are as people. 7-2, they rejected the ultimatum. Prepare for armed confrontation. The official response was drafted in 2 hours. Polite, professional, clear. It rejected all conditions. It noted that humanity's door remained open for discussion of a ceasefire at any time. And at the very end, after 40 minutes of debate, Ray specifically advocated for this last line. Humanity does not surrender what it has built. Not a boast, not a threat, but a statement of fact. She wanted it recorded. She wanted whoever read it on the other side, whoever was more sensible than confident to understand what kind of people they were dealing with before the first shot was fired. After the session, she called her daughter on Proximo Colony B. Her daughter answered, looking tired and scared. Ray spent 45 minutes talking about nothing important, the neighbor's dog, a dumpling recipe, how the colony dome looked from the outside on clear nights, like a glowing drop of water against the dark. They did not talk about the war. They both knew it was there. When the conversation ended, Ray looked at Earth through the window for a long time. Then she picked up her coffee and went back to work. Fleet Captain Marcus Cole received his orders on Thursday and spent 20 minutes in his bunk on the asteroid Kilimanjaro, reading them 3 times to make sure he understood exactly what Admiral Ray was asking. hold the Proxima defense line for 6 weeks against 4,000 ships with only 63. He finished his coffee and headed for the bridge. Kilimanjaro was 22 years old and had the character of a ship that had seen a lot and had opinions about it. 3 sets of scars on the hull from 3 previous engagements. The reactor core had been replaced once and repaired twice. Weaponry that ran on a combination of standard engineering and what Cole personally considered pure stubbornness. She wasn't a beautiful ship, but she was his ship, and there was no distinction he valued more. He called an all-hands meeting. 412 people filled every available space: main deck, cargo bay, corridors where the intercom carried his voice. Engineers with grease on their hands, gunners still blinking from the early wake-up call, medics in white coats, navigators, cafeteria cooks, a man named Toros who had been on the ship longer than anyone except the chief engineer, and who made a noodle soup that 3 sailors had specifically re-enlisted just to keep access to. They all looked at him from the platform. He said it straight. The Vtkai Dominion has declared war on Earth. They have 4,000 warships. We have 63. Battle Group 7 holds the Proxima line for 6 weeks while the reserve fleet completes mobilization. After that, we go on the offensive. He let the numbers sink in. He let them do what honest numbers do when you put them in one room. 6 weeks. That was the mission. 2 seconds of silence. From somewhere deep in the cargo bay, someone said, 4,000 against 63. Finally, a fair fight. The laughter was real, not nervous laughter, not an attempt to dispel the gloom. Sincere, liberated laughter from people who had taken the numbers and found that part of themselves that had always been here. The part that had been here for 10,000 years and decided not to be afraid. Cole needed to know that sound was in his crew. Now he knew. Any questions? A young gunner from the port side, barely 3 years of service. What if they send more than 4,000? Sir, we improvise. More laughter. Dismissed. The Vtkai forward fleet crossed the Terran space on Saturday. 4,000 warships, dense formation, weapons charged. Commanders who had performed calculations in 17 different ways. In all 17 versions, the Proxima defense line fell in less than 14 hours. The advance to the inner colonies was to begin immediately after. Supreme Commander Zevrat stood at the view screen of his flagship as Terran space opened around them and felt a quiet, professional satisfaction in a job well done. He checked his sensor screen. The human formation at the Proxima line detailed as they closed in, and his tactical officer went silent for 3 full seconds before speaking. Sir, the human formation. What about it? They are not in a defensive line. A pause. Their clusters are angled forward, aimed at specific points of our formation. Zevrat looked at the screen. The humans were positioned in 4 small, separated clusters, not stretched across the approach. Waiting to absorb the blow, aimed inward, each cluster targeted different points of the Vtkai column. They are going to attack, his tactical officer said. The disbelief in his voice was not feigned. 63 ships, aimed at 4,000, moving forward. Zevrat thought briefly of Atar's reports. They do not perceive the threat of extinction like other species. He had read those words and understood them as an academic observation. Now he understood them differently. Watching 63 ships accelerate toward him, he gave the order to engage, and on the other side of the dark water between them, Cole's hand dropped. The asteroid Kilimanjaro moved forward, and the war began. The first exchange of fire between humanity and the Vtkai Dominion lasted 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Battle Group 7 fired first, fired accurately, and achieved something that no Vtkai tactical officer could fully explain in their post-battle reports. They disrupted the formation. Not because the damage was overwhelming. 6 ships destroyed out of 4,000 was not overwhelming by any honest measure. The Vtkai tactical officers knew this. Their models knew this. By the numbers, 6 losses were a rounding error. What the models didn't account for was where those 6 ships were in the formation and what removing them specifically demanded of the rest of the fleet. Cole had found the gaps 3 days before the battle, during the transit from the lunar station to Proxima. He spent the time studying all the Vtkai tactical data humanity had gathered from 200 years of careful observation. Formation habits, column intervals, positions of communication repeaters, standard distance between ships in a forward formation, which had been the same for 4,000 years because it worked and nothing had forced them to change. The Vtkai had a perfect formation. That was the problem. The perfect formation was optimized so many times that it became rigid. every ship in its assigned place, linked to the ships around it in carefully designed structural relationships. The system was strong, and strength was at the heart of everything, unless you took away the right pieces. Cole identified 6 ships positioned at specific intervals in the left forward column. Their collective removal would require the entire left column to stop, reorganize, properly fill the gaps, and then resume movement. Doctrine required proper reorganization. You could not leave the column unbalanced. The doctrine was 4,000 years old. It was doctrine because it was right. That reorganization would take 30-50 minutes. 30-50 minutes during which 2,000 of the 4,000 Vtkai ships would not move forward. He didn't tell his team that this was a victory strategy. It wasn't a victory strategy. It was a delay strategy. It was the tactical variable of the entire mission. Make them pay more than they planned. Keep moving. Don't stop. By the time it needed to be bought, Mark Cole said, fire. The asteroid Kilimanjaro fired. 4 other ships in the cluster fired simultaneously. The targeting was coordinated to the millisecond. Each ship was assigned a specific spot on a specific target. 6 Vtkai ships went out in a chain that took less than 4 seconds. The left column buckled. A gap opened. Cole drove into it before it could close. What followed were 11 minutes of precision, followed by 36 days of grinding, costly, exhausting attrition. Cole's cluster hit the gap, punched through, then retreated before the column could surround them. On the right flank, 2 other human clusters stayed out of weapon range and did not attack. They constantly moved, kept the right flank commanders on edge, demanded answers, consumed attention without wasting ships. The 4th cluster separated from the main battle and moved at speed around the exterior, into the very edges of the entire Vtkai fleet, the supply lines leading back to Dominion space, 4 ships threatening the rear of 4,000. Zevrat was not ready for this. No doctrine in 4,000 years of war accounted for this. You didn't put 4 ships in the rear of an enemy fleet unless you were trying to get those 4 ships destroyed. The humans clearly didn't care about the destruction of those 4 ships, because those 4 ships were not there to win the fight. They were there to force him to peel off rear guards, which meant diverting ships from the advance, which meant slowing the advance. He detached 200 ships to deal with them. The 4 human ships immediately ran. They stayed out of weapon range and led the Vtkai ships on a wide loop that took 6 full hours before Zevrat recalled the rear guard. While the rear guard ran in circles, Cole's cluster reformed and hit another structural element of the left column. Then the right flank clusters, which had done nothing for 2 hours but looked threatening, moved together and hit the right column in the same surgical way. Cole had instructed his captains before the battle. His exact words were, "You are not trying to defeat them, you are trying to make them fight each other. Every movement they make in response to you is a choice of where to focus. Make them make choices. Make every choice cost more than it should. Add up the costs." On the 4th day, Battle Group 7 lost its first ship, Terran Emery Bay, a frigate that went too deep into a closed Vtkai pocket while trying to reposition. Its crew of 90, 2 escaped in 12 life pods. Cole noted the loss in his log and made sure his communications officer relayed the full crew list to fleet headquarters within the hour, all 92 names. He didn't dwell on it. He didn't allow himself to dwell on it. He added the names to a list he kept and went back to work, because work was what kept the other names off the list. By the 12th day, Battle Group 7 had lost 7 ships. The Vtkai had lost 41. The numbers still said the Vtkai were winning. The numbers were right, but the numbers had predicted the loss of 4 ships by the 12th day. They had lost 41, and the advance, which should have reached the first inner colony by the 2nd week, was still 2/3 of the way between Proxima and the target. Strike Group Leader Vareed had served in the Vtkai fleet for 12 years and had participated in one previous annexation campaign. He knew what a battle looked like. He knew the patterns. A smaller force fights hard for 2 to 3 days. Then the losses become too great to ignore, and the smaller force makes a rational choice. He was on the 18th day of this campaign. The human fleet was still fighting. He had personally destroyed 4 of their ships. He studied the battle data carefully. The humans were losing ships. Their numbers were dwindling. The models predicted they should have broken no later than the 10th day. The models made that very clear. The models, however, did not seem to be talking to the humans about it. What bothered Varet most was not the persistence. He had been briefed on persistence. What bothered him was how the humans fought when they were losing. In every engagement he had ever studied, a force taking heavy losses began to contract inward, retreat, become defensive, try to save what was left. This was the natural form of an army in decline. The human fleet was not shrinking in form, it was adapting. Ships that had been in combat for 2 weeks fought differently than they had in the first week. New formations, new targets, moves that hadn't appeared in the first week because they were a response to what the Vtkai had done in the second and third weeks. They were learning in real time inside a battle they were losing and applying lessons in the same battle without a pause. He wrote a note in his personal combat log. He was a strike group leader, not an intelligence officer, and no one would read it, but he wrote it anyway. This enemy improves under pressure. I have no tactical category for this behavior. He looked at his targeting screen. Another human ship was approaching, moving through a gap in the formation that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. He went back to work. At his intelligence office on the asteroid Vtkai Dominion, Subcommander Etar wrote her 7th report. For 18 days, the human formation continues to exceed all combat predictions. This is not a tactical error on our part, nor a statistical anomaly. It is the expected result of colliding with a species with this psychological and historical profile under constant pressure. Their resistance does not diminish over time, it increases. Every day of this engagement, they fight better against us specifically than they did yesterday. Their capacity for adaptive improvisation in real time is not a variable accounted for in our models. It must be. She stopped. She carefully chose the next sentence. I am officially expressing concern that the campaign timeline is not viable in its current form. I request an emergency review of combat strategy before the advance proceeds beyond the current position. She submitted the report. It was acknowledged 48 hours later. Action did not follow. On the 19th day, Sauron woke Cole at 3:00 a.m. to inform him that the star battery had taken a direct hit and the backup relay was providing them with 30% power. He followed her to the engine room in just his socks and a shirt that wasn't fully buttoned, and spent 4 hours there with her and 3 of her engineers doing what the asteroid Kilimanjaro always did. Find another way. They rerouted power through a secondary channel designed for atmospheric systems completely unsuited for weapons. Sauron built a manual buffer on the spot from components that, on paper, had different purposes, reinforced it with 2 support struts from a rack no one used, and brought the battery power up to 60%. Is 60% enough? Cole asked. Sauron looked at the buffer the way a sculptor looks at a work that isn't finished yet, but there is no more time. Barely. Don't take a hit in the same spot. I'll take it, he said. He noted the repair in the log as a non-standard maintenance procedure. He didn't note that it voided 3 equipment warranties, because those warranties were not important at the moment. He returned to his bunk, slept for 3 hours, then got up, returned to the bridge, and went back to work. He didn't feel heroic in any of this. He never understood the word heroic as something separate from the word necessary. The mission was clear: hold for 6 weeks. He was in his 3rd week. His ship was still here. 35 of his 63 ships were still here. Every morning he ran the calculations. How many of his people were alive? How many ships were operational? How many more Vtkai had lost than their models had prepared them for? The math was not the math of victory. The math was the math of holding. It was enough. It was all the mission asked for, and he was going to give the mission everything it asked for. In the silence of the observation station, 300 light-years away, Elder Sarita of the Orcs watched as the combat data arrived day after day and said nothing for a long time. On the 28th day, she called her communications assistant. Note this in the observation log, she said. The Vtkai will take longer than they predicted. How much longer? The assistant asked. Sarita looked at the numbers, the slow advance, the disproportionate losses, the undeniable fact that the smaller fleet was changing the behavior of the larger day by day, simply by the friction of never being where they were expected. I do not know, she said. That is why it is worth observing. Her assistant recorded it and said nothing more, because having worked for Sarita for 12 years, he knew that when she said she didn't know, she meant it, and that her ignorance was worth more than most people's certainty. On the 38th day, the reserve fleet arrived. Cole was on his bridge. When the sensor contacts appeared, he counted them twice. 214 ships, freshly built at Earth shipyards, arriving in the Proxima system. He looked at the screen for 5 full seconds. Navigator? Ensign Cho had been on this bridge for 38 days. Her voice now had a quality he hadn't heard since before the first shot. Confirmed, sir. 214 contacts, all with Terran marks. They are holding at the outer perimeter, waiting for your signal. He opened the Battle Group 7 channel. 35 ships, 35 crews, who had worked on what the human body finds after it has used everything it normally uses and seeks more. This is Cole. Reserve fleet is on screen, 214 ships. He paused for 1 minute. We held. The channel exploded. He let it run for 20 seconds. He was smiling and didn't try to stop it. He let it run. Then, battle stations. All ships prepare for new orders from Fleet Command. We are not finished yet. Admiral Ray's orders arrived 6 hours after the reserve fleet made contact. There were 2 words. Advance immediately. The unified Terran fleet, 249 ships, including the 35 battered veterans of Battle Group 7, who carried 38 days of specific knowledge on how these enemies fought, moved forward. Ray had made one decision that Cole requested, and which some of his fellow commanders questioned. The survivors of Battle Group 7 were in the vanguard of the advancing formation. Not in the rear, not in the middle, in the vanguard. The logic was simple. Fresh ships had fresh systems and full crews. What they lacked was 38 days of fighting exactly this enemy, built into the hands and instincts of every captain, gunner, and navigator who had survived until this moment. Cole's captains knew where the gaps were, how the columns moved, how the Vtkai reacted to pressure at every point. This knowledge was now worth more than fresh weapons. And Ray knew it before Cole asked. The unified fleet hit the Vtkai formation at 6 structural points simultaneously. Not at the strongest points, but at the joints in the places where columns met, where communication repeaters connected neighboring sections, where the right flank touched the rear guard. 6 points attacked simultaneously on a battlefield spanning 100 light seconds, coordinated to the millisecond using a communication protocol. Cole had developed with Ray over 4 weeks of encrypted work on unofficial channels. The Vtkai formation buckled at all 6 points simultaneously. On the bridge of the asteroid, Vtkai Dominion, Supreme Commander Zevrat watched his tactical screen and gave orders for stabilization. He was a good commander. He stabilized the formation, closed the gaps, absorbed the losses, and maintained the advance. His numerical superiority still exceeded the human fleet by more than 15 to 1, and he had stabilized before and would stabilize again. But his tactical officer was looking at the data of the human formation, and the expression on his face was one Zevrat had never seen before. "Sir," he said, "the ships that have been in combat for 38 days are leading the new formation." "Confirmed?" "Yes, sir. Veterans in the front." Zevrat looked at the screen. He sat with it for a long time. Every doctrine he had ever studied said, "You rest your worn forces and lead with fresh ones. You preserve your experienced personnel. You keep your weapons sharp." This was not what the humans were doing. Their most exhausted ships, with crews who had been in continuous combat for over a month, were at the tip of the advance, not because they were being spent, but because they were the best. Because 38 days of fighting specifically against this enemy had made them better at it than anyone else. And Ray knew it, and she placed them where that knowledge mattered most. Zevrat looked at the screen for a long time, then very quietly said, "Initiate defensive reorganization." His tactical officer stared at him. In 30 years of service under this commander, he had never heard such an order given as an opening move. "Sir, you heard the order?" Zevrat didn't explain. He was still looking at the screen, at those 35 damaged, patched-up veteran ships moving through his formation with the calm, unhurried precision of people who had been here before and knew exactly what they were doing. For the first time since entering Terran space, he began to understand that he did not fully understand who he was at war with. The advance continued, but something had changed, and he felt it the way one feels a change in weather before the clouds arrive. The war was not going the way he had planned. Ray had planned the counter-offensive from the second week of defensive actions. Not because she was certain. She wasn't certain. She was acting on a special kind of faith that has nothing to do with certainty, the kind that comes from knowing what her people are capable of, and choosing to trust that knowledge even when all the numbers before you say it isn't enough. In the second week, while Cole was running the math of delay on the Proxima line, Ray was doing a different kind of math. Earth shipyards, colonial shipyards on Barnard Star, Station Epsilon Audani, the orbital platform over Proxima Colony B, which was 40 years old and had spent most of its life building cargo freighters. Never a warship, but it had the people, the equipment, and the supply of raw materials to begin. The Terran Council approved the full production request in 48 hours, the fastest they had ever agreed to anything in their lives. Not because they weren't afraid, they were afraid, and they decided to do something about it. The message that went to every shipyard in human space consisted of 3 sentences. We are at war. We need ships. How fast? The answers came back practical and specific. The chief administrator of the Proximo Orbital Shipyard sent a production estimate 40% higher than its best peacetime output and attached a single note. We will find the people. Give us the materials. Humanity gave them the materials. In 6 weeks, Earth and its colonies launched 37 new warships. Not the most complex designs, there was no time for the most complex designs. Ships built quickly according to existing templates, adapted to the tactical requirements that Cole was relaying from the Proxima front in real time. Wider weapon spread angles, better shielding, improved power management for the duty cycle revealed in battle. Cole's reports from the front were not just combat logs. It was a 6-week education on Vtkai formation behavior, sent to every engineer and tactical analyst with clearance to read them. Every gap he found, every structural weakness he exploited, every Vtkai response that revealed something about how their doctrine worked. By the time the reserve fleet was assembled, humanity knew more about how the Vtkai fought than any species had known before starting a war against them. The advance hit the Vtkai formation at 6 structural points simultaneously, and the first 3 hours went the way Cole told his captains. Not perfect. Nothing in real combat goes perfectly. RNS Kilimanjaro took a side hit in the 2nd hour that reduced its left maneuver thruster to 60% power, which meant Cole had to adjust his approach vectors on the fly and recalculate timing for his 2nd strike cluster. He did the calculation in his head in less than a minute and gave the navigator new numbers, and they kept moving, but the form of it was right. 6 simultaneous strikes at 6 structural points disrupted the Vtkai formation at its joints before it could strengthen, and the human fleet passed through the cracks. As Cole had learned over 38 days, the Vtkai response was fast. It was always fast. 4,000 years of discipline meant that when the formation was struck, the response was immediate and coordinated. Gaps closed, columns reformed. The advance slowed but did not stop. What changed now was that the humans weren't trying to hold a line. They were advancing. Every time the Vtkai closed a gap, the human fleet found the next joint and hit it. Every time the Vtkai reformed a column, Cole's captains were already looking at the new form of reformation and identifying what the reformation had created. A defensive reorganization always created something. A new angle, a new gap, a temporary weakness somewhere else while ships found their positions. 38 days of observing this enemy's reorganization had taught Cole's captains to read those moments before they fully formed. Commander Addis, operating a human cluster on the left flank, hit a reorganization gap with such precision that her tactical officer asked afterward how she knew it would be there. Addis thought about it. I didn't know, she said. I just knew they would have to put it somewhere. That was the difference. Vtkai doctrine told their commanders where to look. Cole's veterans had spent 38 days studying the doctrine itself and finding where it would create the next opening chance. The galaxy watched quietly, not with public statements or announced positions. Civilizations that existed in the wider neighborhood of Vtkai space had long been cautious and silent, because the Dominion had a 4,000-year military history, and caution and silence kept most of them intact. But they watched. The Citrian Union had been a member of the Vtkai Dominion for 800 years. They had their own ships, their own space, their own government in all aspects that did not contradict Dominion requirements. 800 years of careful compliance had built them a stable, quiet existence. They accepted it because the alternative was always clear. Ambassador Drat, a cautious and long-serving official in the Dominion Command, had watched the Proxima combat data for 38 days, then requested a private meeting with his senior advisors. He laid the numbers on the table. The Vtkai forward fleet has been in combat for 38 days against 63 human warships. They have lost 103 ships. Their advance has reached 62% of the projected position. He looked around the table. The humans launched 37 new ships last week. No one spoke immediately. They are building ships faster than the Dominion is destroying them, one of his advisors said very cautiously. Yes, Drat said. Another silence. What do we do with this information? A second advisor asked. Drat looked at the numbers for a long time. 800 years of caution, 800 years of compliance. He had been in this role for 30 of those years and never imagined he would sit in this room and feel what he was feeling right now, which was something between hope and vertigo. "We observe," he said very carefully, "and we wait to see what happens next." Elder Sarita of the Orcs did not just watch the combat data, she watched the shape of things. On the 46th day of the campaign, she called her senior advisors and told them to prepare an official contact package for the Terran government. Not an offer of alliance, not yet. Something more cautious. An introduction. A signal that the Orcs knew who the humans were, had watched them for a long time, and did not think this war was going the way the Vtkai expected. Her advisors asked if this was wise, given the Dominion's current position. "The Dominion's current position is exactly why it is the right time," she said. 4,000 years is a long time to be the only answer. Something new is happening. It is worth being on the side of something new. She sent the contact package through a diplomatic channel that the Dominion did not control, because the Dominion had never needed to control it and had never thought to begin. Humanity received the message. Ray read it at her desk at the lunar station, a brief and cautious message from a civilization whose existence she knew of, but had never directly contacted. It stated in formal language that the Orcs were aware of the conflict, had been following it with great interest, and wished to establish preliminary contact. And then, in the last line, something unusual for a formal diplomatic message: "You should know that we have carefully read your proposal of conditions. We think it says more about who you are than anything else you have done." Ray read the last line twice. Then she wrote a reply. Zevrat requested reinforcements at the end of the 7th week. He had held off for 3 weeks longer than any tactical analysis said he should, which in itself was a kind of admission. He held off because requesting reinforcements meant admitting that current forces were insufficient, and for 4,000 years, the word insufficient was not in the working lexicon of the Vtkai army. But the numbers spoke for themselves. His forward fleet had lost 141 ships in 7 weeks. The human fleet had grown to 286, a ratio that had started as 63:1, squeezed by losses on one side and production on the other to just under 15:1. Still a dominating advantage. Still, by any standard measure, a winning position. But the rate of change was wrong. 800 additional warships arrived from the Dominion's border reserves on the 8th week. His total strength rose to over 4,600. The ratio opened up again. He felt the satisfaction of a commander who had identified a problem and solved it correctly. In her quarters, Itar received the notification of the reinforcement order and sat with it for a long time. Then she wrote her 8th report. "The additional fleet deployment significantly increases our total numerical advantage. I note for the record that numerical advantage has not been the limiting factor in this engagement. The Terran fleet's advantages are behavioral and adaptive. More ships will not change the nature of the problem. It will delay the moment when the problem becomes inevitable. The Terran fleet is growing. Their production capacity has increased every week since the war began. Their tactical capabilities improve in direct proportion to the time they spend fighting us. These two trends move in only one direction. I officially request the Supreme Commander consider a ceasefire before the campaign reaches the Sol system. The terms offered at the beginning remain available. Every week we do not accept them, those terms become more expensive to restore." She submitted it. It was acknowledged 4 days later. When the acknowledgement came, it read, "Report received. Continue observation." Itar closed the file. She did not write a 9th report. There was nothing in a 9th report that hadn't been in the first 8. She had been right in all of them. And still, no one read it as anything other than a subordinate showing excessive caution. Instead, she opened her personal files, the data of human history she had spent 3 years reading. She found a record she had thought about many times since the beginning of the war. Small island nation. Cities bombed every night. 4 years of fighting what should have been impossible to fight. She read it again. Then she closed it and went back to her observational work, because work was what she had, and she was going to continue doing it right, even if no one acted on it. In any war, there was a resource the Vtkai never needed to account for. It wasn't in their tactical models because it couldn't be easily measured. It wasn't ships, it wasn't weapons, it wasn't trained personnel. It was what happens when a civilization of 20 billion people decides the battle is personal. On the 8th week, the Terran Council passed the Act of Full Mobilization. It wasn't a draft campaign. Drafts were for moving unwilling people to battle. This was the opposite, the removal of all obstacles for people who had decided they wanted to help find their place. The act created open channels between civilian expertise and military needs, removed bureaucratic barriers between the defense industry and the scientific community, and asked a very simple question of 20 billion people: what can you do? The answers arrived in a volume that overwhelmed the sorting system on the first day. Engineers arrived. Scientists arrived. Civilian pilots who flew the colony supply lines brought their knowledge of the space landscape that wasn't on military navigation maps. Retired military personnel returned and didn't need retraining. Young people who had planned to enter university arrived and asked for tasks. Physicists arrived not because they knew anything about weapons, but because they knew things about materials and energy that weapons designers hadn't thought to ask. A team of civilian engineers at a repair yard on Titan, given 3 weeks and a specific problem Cole had identified in his combat reports, developed a modification to the Terran warship's standard point defense system that increased its effective range by 30% against targeting patterns. The modification used existing components in a configuration that no one in the military design department had considered because it was slightly outside standard practice. It worked, was approved, and was deployed to the fleet within 72 hours. A professor of logistics at the University of New Sao Paulo read the publicly available battle data and the Dominion's own open diplomatic records and wrote a 4-page analysis that revealed 3 specific vulnerabilities in the Vtkai supply chain that the military had missed. She sent it to fleet headquarters, expecting it to be filed and forgotten. Ray called her personally the next day. The professor's analysis became the basis for the next 3 weeks of Terran targeting priorities. Cole received the specifications for the modified point defense and the updated targeting priorities on the same day and read them both carefully. The point defense modification was the work of engineers who had never designed weapons. The supply chain analysis was the work of a woman whose career had been in civilian cargo logistics. Neither had formal military training. He thought about what the Vtkai tactical models had said about humanity. He thought that the models had counted 63 ships. He thought they had forgotten to count everyone else. The order to retreat to the Sol defense position arrived on the morning of the 61st day. Cole read it and understood immediately. The Vtkai, with their reinforced fleet, were pushing hard toward the inner system. The battle was going to shift to the home ground that humanity had been preparing for weeks. Deep space is where you delay. Home is where you make them pay for the approach. He sent the order to his captains and went to find his executive officer, Commander Addis, who was reviewing damage reports in the secondary operations room. "We are pulling back to Sol," Cole said. Addis put down his datapad. "They will follow. They will follow with everything they have left. That's the point." Cole looked at the star map on the wall, at the small yellow dot of the sun in the center, at the colonies scattered from it like seeds. 9 weeks of making it expensive, making it personal, forcing them to commit more than they planned. Now we will make them pay for getting close enough to see it. Addis was silent for a moment. His face held the expression of a person running a calculation they didn't entirely want to make. Then it settled into something simpler, which wasn't quite a smile but had its shape. "Their problem," he said. Cole gave the order to retreat. The fleet turned home. Behind them followed 4,600 Vtkai warships. Ahead, Earth waited, as it had always waited, old and scarred, full of people who had been through fire before and never stopped finding reasons to return. The final part of the war was beginning. The Vtkai fleet reached the edge of the Sol system on the 61st day of the war. From Earth, they were not yet visible to the naked eye. They were data on screens, lights on sensor arrays, numbers moving across tactical displays. But 20 billion people knew they were coming. The planet had been preparing for this for 9 weeks in a specific sense. A civilization prepares when most of its people are not soldiers, but all of them have decided the battle belongs to them. Factories worked 2 shifts. Shipyards were lit at night. Families in apartments watched news feeds and didn't talk about what the numbers meant. The cities were very quiet, in a specific way, the silence of people who are attentive. Admiral Ray had been sleeping in her office for 2 weeks. She wasn't working 24/7. She tried very hard not to work 24/7, because she had learned enough about command to know that exhausted decisions are bad decisions, and too many people depended on her decisions to allow them to be bad. She slept for 4 hours at a time, ate normal food, and every morning before the briefing began, took a 30-minute walk along the observation corridor of the station. She did these things intentionally, as acts of professional discipline. She slept in her office because leaving it felt wrong. She couldn't exactly explain why, but the screens were there, the data was there, The people making decisions based on her leadership were there, and she needed to be close to it, even when she wasn't working, because this was her post. And she didn't leave her post. The human fleet was positioned on the outer perimeter of the Sol system, now 291 ships. The last batch of new construction had arrived 3 days earlier, including 6 heavy cruisers that had been on the stocks when the war began, and were completed in 7 weeks, 4 weeks faster than any previous record in the history of Terran shipbuilding. The shipyards didn't stop. The people didn't stop. The ratio was just over 15 to 1. Still an impossible mathematical ratio by any standard measure. Still numbers that, if you had shown them to someone who didn't know what had happened over the last 9 weeks, would look like a predetermined outcome. Ray stopped doing the math 3 weeks ago, not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer important. Cole received his assignment on the morning of the 61st day and went for a walk through the ship. Not an inspection, he knew the ship's exact condition without an inspection. He walked the decks because he had learned years ago that before a major engagement, his crew worked better if they saw his face. No speech, no briefing, just his presence moving through the spaces where they lived and worked, visible and calm. It was a small thing. It cost him an hour. He never regretted it. He stopped in the engine room and spent 20 minutes with Sauron, who was bent over a modified weapon repeater she had been perfecting for the last week. The modification came from a materials science paper she had downloaded from the Public Research Network, written by a university professor on Earth, whose entire career before the war had been dedicated to stress resistance in transport infrastructure. Nothing to do with weapons. Everything to do with how materials behave under heat and pressure at the molecular level. Sauron read it, understood something in it that the professor hadn't anticipated, and turned it into a modification that increased the repeater's thermal resistance by 12%. 12% meant the weapon battery could hold fire longer before the repeater needed a shutdown cycle. In a prolonged engagement, the difference between being in the fight at the 40-minute mark and not being in the fight at the 40-minute mark was not small. "It holds," Soren said without looking up from the repeater. "Good," he said. "Don't take a hit in the repeater housing. Add it to the list." He went around the rest of the decks, gunners, medics, the navigation team calculating approaches to positions they hoped not to use. To the cook, who had made coffee for 400 people and looked like a man who had decided that making good coffee today was something he could do, and he would do it as well as it had ever been done. Cole drank the coffee. It was very good. He returned to the bridge. He had 4 hours until the projected window of first contact. He sat in his seat and wrote a message to his daughter, who was 16 and lived with her mother in a coastal town on Earth. He sent her a message before every significant engagement for 2 years, and she never asked him to stop, which told him something important about her. He wrote, "Doing my job. Proud of you. See you when this is over." He believed it. He wasn't sure it was true. He sent it anyway, because belief was real even if certainty wasn't, and she deserved real. He closed the message. He looked at his tactical screen. He had 4 hours. He used them to review the plan one more time. At 14, 23, 60, first day, the forward columns crossed the outer boundary of the Sol system. The battle began. Cole's cluster hit first, as he always hit first. Kilimanjaro and the 5 ships around her punched through the gap between the Vtkai forward column and its neighboring support column with the specific, practiced precision of a team that had been doing exactly this for 61 days. The forward column fired where they were. The asteroid Kilimanjaro fired where they needed to be. 3 Vtkai ships at the front of the forward column went out. The column buckled. On the right flank, Addis hit the corresponding point of the right column. A second later, 2 more Vtkai ships were destroyed. The right column buckled in the same way. Both flanks cracked in the first 8 minutes. It wasn't as clean as Cole had planned. It never was. A Vtkai heavy cruiser that should have been occupied by Addis's cluster broke formation and headed straight for the asteroid Kilimanjaro, and Cole had to pull the ship up and over in a maneuver that used the engine assembly in a way Soren would later have an opinion about, and a near miss left a long burn along the top of the hull that added another line to the ship's long biography, but the form held. 6 simultaneous strikes on 6 structural points. The plan Ray had spent 3 weeks building from Cole's combat data, the supply chain analysis from the civilian professor, and all the fleet's accumulated knowledge the form held, the Vtkai formation cracked, and the human fleet passed through the cracks. In a town on the coast, Sophia Cole sat on the roof of her building with her mother and looked at the sky. She knew the battle had begun. The newsfeed said so. Tactical displays which civilians weren't supposed to fully understand but could see the shape of showed the Vtkai mass and the smaller human cluster and how the gap between them changed. She could read the shape, even if she couldn't read the numbers. She looked at the sky because it was what she could do. She was 16, not a soldier, not an engineer, and had no skills the war needed. She was someone's daughter, and she looked at the sky because her father was up there, and looking at it felt like the only honest action. The roof was crowded. Her neighbors had brought chairs. Someone had brought a small portable heater. Someone else had brought food that no one ate. The whole city was doing something similar. She knew 15 million people in this city alone. Most of them were looking up at the sky, which gave them no specific information, because looking up was all that was available. Her mother held her hand, and they didn't talk about the numbers in the feeds. Sophia had read her father's last message 11 times. She knew it because she counted. "See you when this is over." She held the phone in her other hand, looked at the sky, and didn't let herself think about what "when this is over" meant. Zevrat stabilized. He was an experienced commander, and stabilization was what experienced commanders did when their formation took damage, close gaps, reform columns, absorb losses, and maintain the advance. His fleet still outnumbered the humans by more than 15-1, and he had stabilized under worse pressure than this in previous campaigns. But something about this engagement was not like previous campaigns. He felt it in the tactical data the way one feels, a change in temperature before one can name what it means. The human fleet was faster than it had been at Proxima. Not faster in pure speed, the specs hadn't changed. Faster in reaction. The time between a Vtkai action and a human counteraction had been shrinking for 9 weeks, and this compression was noticeable. His formation closed a gap, and the human cluster was already exploiting the new form of the closing before it was complete. His columns reformed, and a human ship was already moving to the angle that the reforming created. They weren't predicting his moves. They were reading his doctrine faster than the doctrine could produce moves, and reacting to where the doctrine was heading before it arrived. He had spent 9 weeks teaching them how his fleet fought. He realized it now. Every engagement, every response, every restructuring. They were reading all of it, archiving all of it, building a specific understanding of the Vtkai way of war that now lived in his enemy's hands. Commanders like the craftsman's knowledge lived in their hands. He summoned Atar to the command room. She was there in 4 minutes. She was clearly awake. He didn't ask how she knew to be ready. He said, "Tell me what you see." She looked at the combat data for a long time. "They know our doctrine," she said. "Not from intelligence data from 61 days of combat. Their response patterns are not calculated. They are reflexive now. Their captains feel where the next gap will be before it exists." She paused. "We taught them this. Every engagement we conducted against them was a lesson, and they never stopped learning. What do I do about this?" It wasn't quite a question. It was the voice of a commander asking aloud what he already knew. "You cannot unteach them," she said. "You cannot make them forget what 61 days in this battle put into their bodies." She looked at the screen, at the human clusters moving through his formation with the ease of people navigating a familiar room. "The only thing that changes this equation is if we stop giving them new lessons, which is a ceasefire," she said. Now, before this goes any further, Zevrat looked at the combat data. His advance was still going. He was still winning by the numbers. He looked at the speed with which the numbers were changing and performed a calculation he had avoided for the last 3 weeks. He did not answer her. "Supreme Commander," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I submitted 8 reports. I was right in all 8. I ask you to read the 9th before I write it." He was silent for a long time. Then pull up the reserve deployment interface. She looked at him. She saw what he was about to do. She didn't argue. She had learned from the 8 reports when arguing was useful and when it wasn't. "Yes, sir," she said and stepped back. He engaged the Dominion's full reserve. The sensor screen in front of him filled with new contacts. A total of 6,200 warships against 291. He looked at the ratio and felt it the way he was meant to feel it, not as comfort, but as an affirmation of what the last 9 weeks had cost him, that he needed this many ships to feel confident. At Lunar Station 1, Ray looked at the new contacts appearing on her tactical screen and sat with the number for a long time. 6,200. And her tactical officer was very calm. She had been here before, in the sense that she had spent 9 weeks preparing for the possibility that the enemy would throw everything they had at them. She had plans, good plans, built on 61 days of specific knowledge and 20 billion human contributions. She also privately hoped they wouldn't. She stood. She walked to the communications console and opened a wideband channel non-military, unencrypted, all frequencies that Vtkai ships could receive. She spoke in standard Vtkai. She knew they had translators. "This is Admiral John Ray, commander of the Terran fleet." She kept her voice steady, not hard, not scared. The voice of someone who says exactly what they are saying and nothing more. "We note the addition of your reserve forces to this engagement." A 2-second pause. "Intentional. Our door remains open." She closed the channel. Her tactical officer turned to look at her. "Admiral, bring me coal," she said, "and bring me the captains of every ship from the 6th construction batch. We have work to do." She sat back down. She looked at the 6,200 lights on her screen. She thought of her grandfather's great-grandmother in Manila, who saw an occupying force coming, fed people, hid things, and stayed exactly where she was because it was her place and she had decided that long ago. And the decision hadn't changed. Ray had made her version of that decision long ago. She picked up her coffee, opened the targeting priority analysis, and began to work. The battle continued throughout the night and the next day. In the 9th hour, Kilimanjaro took a direct hit in the lower left quadrant that blew out the secondary hull plating on the 7th deck and sent 5 crew members to the med bay. Cole received the damage report in 3 minutes. He read it, made sure all 5 crew members were alive, and sent the damage assessment to Sauron with one line. "What do we have left?" Sauron's reply came in 11 minutes. "Everything that matters, keep flying." He kept flying. At the 14th hour, Cole was doing what he always did in prolonged combat, looking at the data somewhat detachedly, letting his tactical brain work on the shape of the engagement rather than its individual parts, when he noticed something in the Vtkai reaction intervals. They had become slower, not much, but they closed the gap a fraction of a second longer than an hour ago. A formation adjustment that should have taken 45 seconds took 60. Tiny numbers, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Easy to dismiss if you saw them but had never spent 61 days specifically studying this enemy. Cole had been looking for them. He had been looking for them since Admiral Ray wrote to him 2 weeks ago. "Every war has a moment when the math stops being what matters," he said. "Tactical. Run the Vtkai reaction intervals for the last 20 minutes and compare them with the first hour." A pause. The sound of calculations running. Then, "Sir, they are degrading. Average reaction time has increased by 11%. Not a collapse, not a breakthrough, a degradation." A massive, ancient machine of a fleet, running on 4,000-year-old doctrine, was for the first time showing a specific kind of strain that comes from being forced to do what the machine wasn't built to do. For 9 weeks, and then one more day. Cole opened the fleet channel. "All captains, look at the VTHI reaction intervals for the last 20 minutes compared to baseline. Confirm what tactical is showing me." Confirmations came in over the next 4 minutes, one after another. Every captain read the same numbers. Every captain understood what those numbers meant. He leaned forward. "Prepare a coordinated strike. All ships. Target package. Foxtrot." Target package. Foxtrot was a plan Ray had built for a specific moment. Not the moment of enemy breakthrough, but the first moment of enemy deceleration. The first crack. You don't need a breakthrough. You need a crack, and you must be ready for it when it appears. And you need every ship in the fleet to hit it simultaneously. They had been ready for 3 weeks. "On my signal," Cole said, "all ships." He looked at the 6,000 lights on his screen, at the crack in the massive machine that had taken 61 days and 9 weeks of grueling effort and 20 billion human stubbornness to create. Mark. 291 human ships fired simultaneously. For the first time in 4,000 years of Vtkai military history, the advance stopped. Not retreated, not broke, stopped. And on the roof of the building in the coastal town on Earth, the 16-year-old girl looked at the sky that gave her no information, held her mother's hand, and continued to look because her father was up there, and looking felt like the only honest action. The crack did not turn into a collapse for an hour. It became 1-4. Zevrat was too experienced for a full collapse. He retreated, he consolidated. He compressed the formation into a tighter core and accepted the sacrifice of the outer columns, which was doctrine for a fleet that experienced unexpected pressure and needed stabilization. He had done it before. It had always worked before. What had never happened before was that the adversary followed the consolidation as fast as it happened. Cole's captains didn't stop to assess the new shape of the formation. They entered the compression as it occurred, finding the angles the compression created before the compression was complete. The knowledge was in their hands now. 62 days and 14 hours of specific, accumulated, irreplaceable knowledge of how this fleet moved when it was wounded. They didn't need to calculate. They read it like reading a familiar face. Zevrat closed one gap, and two others opened. He closed them, and the pressure came from another angle. He restructured his left column, and the right column was attacked before the left column finished its movement. The machine was working correctly. The doctrine was being followed accurately. The doctrine produced opening chances that destroyed his ships. He had built a perfect system over 4,000 years. The system was perfect. The enemy had spent 62 days studying the system well enough to use it against him. He stood at his command screen, looked at the numbers, and didn't look away, because he was the commander who believed you owed your people to look the truth of the situation in the eye, even when the truth was something you had been refusing for the last 9 weeks. The truth was this: he was not losing the war the way he would have expected to lose if he lost. He wasn't being overwhelmed by superior firepower or superior numbers. He was being exhausted by an enemy that had turned his own patterns into weapons and didn't stop and never stopped and wasn't going to stop. He thought about Atar's first report 3 years ago, before the campaign, before the ultimatum, before all of this. There is no bottom. That was the Orc's message. He didn't know what it meant then. Now he understood it in the specific, visceral sense in which you understand a thing when you are standing inside it. They hadn't found a bottom. There was no bottom to be found. Every price he imposed on them, they absorbed and turned into fuel. Every week of this war, they returned stronger and more specifically dangerous than the week before. He had brought 6,000 ships to the edge of their home system and stopped their advance for the first time in 4,000 years. He had run out of options that didn't lead to a place he didn't want to go. He turned to the communications station. "Open a channel to the Terran Fleet Command," he said. "Command frequency authenticated." His communications officer did not hesitate. He had been watching the combat data for 14 hours. He opened the channel in 15 seconds. Zevrat waited. Ray received the connection request on the 62nd day. She hadn't slept for 4 hours. She had eaten breakfast. She had taken her morning walk along the observation corridor and looked at the stars. She thought about nothing useful for 30 minutes, because sometimes nothing useful is what the brain needs before it can do what follows next. The request came on the command frequency. Authenticated. Supreme Commander Zevrat, Vtkai Dominion, Forward Fleet. She opened the channel. "Admiral Ray," he said. "Supreme Commander," she said. The translator worked in both directions. They spoke two completely different languages and heard each other clearly. And she thought for a moment that there was something there worth holding on to, although she was too tired to chase it into a metaphor right now. A pause longer than the communication delay explains. "You said," he began, "in your broadcast yesterday, that your door remains open." "Yes," she said. "Did you mean it?" It wasn't quite a question. She heard what was beneath it. A commander with a 4,000-year continuous history asking a woman he had been trying to destroy for 9 weeks if she meant the peace offer. Was it sincere or tactical? Were humans the kind of people who said the door was open and meant it? "I meant it from the first message we sent," she said. "I meant it every time I said it. I mean it now." Another pause. "I would like to discuss terms," he said. She held it for a moment, not for the sake of drama. She wasn't a dramatic person. She was a person who had wanted this since the first shot was fired, who had written it in all official messages, and had said it on the open channel during the hardest hours of the hardest battle of her life. Because she had always known that a door is only worth something when it is truly open. "Tell me what you are proposing," she said. The Vtkai had prepared standard conditions before leaving Dominion space. They were conditions that a great power offered a lesser one that had proven more expensive than predicted. Return of 2 colonies as a concession, requirement for reduction of fleet size, an agreement for management oversight that left the Dominion in a supervisory role generous by Dominion standards, structured to keep the relationship with the Dominion still standing at the top. Ray read the proposal. She set it aside. "These are not terms we will accept," she said. "Silence." "Then we offer significant concessions," he said. "Admiral, what are you proposing?" "Yes," she said. "I understand this, and I want you to know that I take it seriously, but these are not the terms." She opened the document she and the council had prepared 3 weeks ago, when the shape of the war became clear and she had begun. Cautiously, not saying it aloud, I believe this conversation might actually happen. This is what we ask. She transmitted it to the asteroid Eternal Dominion. Zevrat read it. He read it twice. It was not what he expected. It wasn't punitive. These were not the terms of a winner using the advantage of a defeated enemy. It didn't take territory from the Dominion. It didn't require reparations that would take a generation to pay. It didn't require submission or any permanent relationship in which the Vtkai would answer to humanity. It had 3 conditions. First, full, permanent, legally binding recognition of Terran sovereignty over all 12 current colonies and all future human-settled territories. Not negotiations, not terms that could be revised. A fact. Recorded in the laws of the Dominion that human space is human space and will remain so. Second, a mutual non-aggression agreement, ensured not by Dominion oversight but by a joint commission including neutral third parties. The Orcs had already agreed to serve in this role. Ray had contacted them 2 weeks ago. Third, the immediate right of any species currently under Dominion management to hold a referendum on the question of sovereignty. Zevrat read the third condition 3 times. You are asking us to allow our member species to vote for independence. Anyone who wants to, she said. Not everyone will want to remain, but any species that wants to ask the question will get the opportunity to ask it. This will significantly change the structure of our Dominion. Perhaps, she paused for a moment, or it will make it something people will participate in by choice, rather than something they remain in because they have no other option. How this will happen is your job. I think you can do it if you decide to. She paused. We do not want to destroy you, Supreme Commander. We never wanted to destroy you. We want to exist. We want to build things and keep what we build, and go where we decide to go. That is all we ever wanted. A long pause. You want to exist, he said. We want to exist, she said. And we think other people should have the opportunity to make that same choice. The pause stretched. She allowed it to stretch. She had said true things, and there was nothing that could be added to true things. I will need to consult the High Council, he said. Take as much time as you need, she said. We will hold our position. She closed the channel, leaned back, and looked at the ceiling of her office for a long time. Then she called her daughter on Proximo Colony B and said it was almost the end. The ceasefire agreement was signed in 66 hours. Ray signed for humanity. Zevrat signed for the Dominion. Elder Sarita of the Orcs, 300 light-years away, witnessed the agreement via further authenticated communication because she had been observing since the first shot was fired. And it was right that she saw the end. When the final confirmation came, Sarita was silent on her observation station for a long time. Then she turned to her senior assistant and said, Send a notification to all observation posts. Orcs. Mark this date in the main log. She thought for a moment. She noted the following. Today, the Vtkai Dominion encountered something it could not survive. And the thing it could not survive, when it won, asked for it. She handed the copy of the 3 conditions to her assistant. Read the third one carefully, she said. They won the war for their survival. And the first thing they did with victory was extend the question to people they had never met. She looked at the stars. She had observed humanity for decades. She had sent the Vtkai 2 warnings they did not read. She had written in the long log that this species was something the galaxy had never seen before, and she meant it as a tactical observation and as something more. Now she realized, the more it wasn't the battle. Other species had fought just as hard and long. It wasn't the stubbornness. Stubbornness was remarkable, but not unique. It was what they did when stubbornness was no longer needed. When the door finally opened and they walked through it with terms in hand, they had spent 10,000 years fighting each other, bearing the huge costs of survival, of territory, of the right to exist. And when they won the greatest battle of their cosmic history, when they had the opportunity to demand almost anything, they wrote 3 lines. We want to exist. We want what we built. And we want others to have the opportunity to decide for themselves. She added 1 more line to the long log. Watch this species. They are not finished, I think. They are only starting. And the way they start matters, because those who start like this tend to continue. She closed the log. In Dominion space, 847 species received notification of the referendum. Most of them read it 2 or 3 times. Some of them didn't understand it immediately. All of them eventually realized that a species they had never met had won a war against the most powerful military force in the known galaxy and had spent one of its three conditions on people they owed nothing to. Some of those species would vote to stay with the Dominion. Some wouldn't. All would remember. Cole received the ceasefire notification at 8:31, while Kilimanjaro was conducting a full damage assessment after 62 days of war. The ship had 14 new scars on the hull. Deck 7 had a patched section where the lower hull had been blown out 2 days ago. The left maneuver thruster was operating at 73% after the near miss. On the first day of the battle for Sol, Soren had a list of 17 repairs she wanted to start immediately, and 3 she called urgent, which to Sauron was the equivalent of an alarm signal. Cole read the ceasefire notification. He sat with it for a while. He had sat with big things, quietly, for 62 days. Now he was good at it, as he hadn't been before the war. The silence that follows a huge thing is its own work, and he gave it as much time as it needed. Then he opened the all-ship channel. "Attention to all crew. This is Cole." His voice was level. He was so exhausted that it went beyond the body and permeated the deeper parts of you, the parts that control everything. But the levelness was real. Ceasefire confirmed. The war is over. A pause. Stand down from battle readiness. Begin damage assessment. Get food. Rest. He stopped. He wasn't good at speeches. He had never been good at speeches and never pretended to be. He said what needed to be said in the only way he knew how to say it. You held the line when it needed to be held. You advanced when it needed to be advanced. You adapted every day to things that had never been done before. And you continued when continuing was the only thing on the table. 22 ships lost. 174 names. I will spend the rest of my life making sure they are not forgotten. Another pause. I have no better word than this. You were everything this ship required of you. That is all. He closed the channel. 4 minutes later, a message arrived from Addis on the asteroid Terran Mombasa, 50 meters from the port side. 4 words. I told you, their problem. Cole read it and laughed. A real one. The first real laugh in 62 days. He sat alone on the bridge of a two-year-old ship that had survived more than any ship deserved, and laughed until his eyes filled with moisture, and he didn't try to stop it. Then he submitted his final combat report. He listed the losses first. 22 ships, 174 names in full, one after another, with rank, colony of origin, and years of service. He had been doing this since the first loss and was doing it now, just as he had every time, because names were not statistics, and he was not going to treat them as statistics. Then he wrote, Battle Group. 7 held the Proxima defense line for 38 days against a force outnumbering us by more than 60. 1. We advanced for 23 days after the general engagement. The crew worked beyond any evaluation I could write for them. Therefore, I will not attempt to. I am proud of every name in this report, living and dead alike. He submitted it. He called Sauron and asked where she wanted to start the repairs. She told him the 7th deck, and he went down to the 7th deck and spent the next 3 hours working next to her, because the ship needed repairs, and he had 2 hands and some time. Itar wrote her final report 4 days after the ceasefire. She sat in her quarters on the Eternal Dominion, with the battle records open on one screen and the files of human history she had spent 3 years reading open on the other. And she wrote, 9 weeks and 2 days of active combat. Total Vtkai losses, 412 ships. Total Terran losses, 29 ships. Numerical superiority at the start of combat was greater than 63:1. The final ratio at the moment of the ceasefire had squeezed to just under 21:1. The compression was caused by 3 factors: increase in Terran production, Vtkai losses, and the improvement of Terran tactics during the combat. All 3 factors moved in one direction and were accelerating. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote the part that wasn't a tactical assessment. I spent 3 years studying this species. I was right in 8 reports about their abilities and the nature of the risk they represented. I believe I was right because I carefully read their history, which showed a consistent pattern. Under sufficient pressure, the Terran species does not degrade. It improves. It finds resources in itself that no external assessment would have predicted. It converts confrontation into information and uses the information without pause. What I did not fully foresee, because I did not know where to look, was what they would do when pressure was no longer necessary. The third condition. The ceasefire agreement has no tactical value for the Terran species. It does not expand their territory, their fleet, or their security. Excluding it costs them nothing and gives them no measurable benefit. They included it anyway. I have been trying to understand why for 4 days. I think the answer is that, for humanity, victory and what you do with victory are not separate questions. 10,000 years of war in their history did not make them wish to impose on others. It made them wish for others to have what they fought for, the right to decide. I have no tactical category for this. I am not sure that tactical category is the right frame. I wrote 8 reports warning that this species is not like anything in our library. I thought about their capacity for war. I should have also thought about their capacity for what follows it. She closed the file. On her screen, the human history files were still open. Island Nation, 4 years of fighting what should have been impossible to fight. She had read that file hundreds of times as proof of what humanity will do when it is losing. Now, for the first time, she read it as proof of what humanity does when it wins. They returned every time. They always returned. And every time they returned, they built something not just weapons, ships, and defenses, but something else. Something harder to measure. Some accumulation of understanding of how much survival cost and what that obligation placed on them. You spent that cost, and then you tried to ensure that others wouldn't have to. She closed the file. On the roof in the coastal town, at 8:47 on Wednesday morning, which was not much different from the Tuesday morning 9 weeks ago, Sophia Cole's phone rang. She hadn't slept since early morning. She slept poorly. She had been watching the news feed since midnight and saw the confirmation of the ceasefire at 2:31 and cried for a long time, then stopped, then cried again. And then her mother made tea, and they sat together in the kitchen until the sky began to change. The message was from her father. War is over. Ship needs repairs. 3 weeks, maybe 4. A pause in the message log that meant he had stopped and started again. Will tell you when I am home. Proud of you. See you soon. She read it 3 times. Then she went to the roof. The sun was rising over the water, doing what it always did, indifferent to the 62 days that had just passed, continuing on its course, because the sun didn't need to know what happened to continue being the sun. The city below her was waking up. She could hear it, the slow sounds of 15 million people starting an ordinary morning for the first time in 9 weeks. She looked at the sky. It was very blue, very old, full of stars that couldn't be seen in the day but were still there, like things that exist even when you don't see them. Her father was somewhere out there, on a ship that needed repairs for 3 weeks, already filing reports, checking damage, and drinking what Toros had prepared in the cafeteria. He had done his job. He always did his job. He was coming home. She looked at the sky for a long time. Somewhere in it, something had changed. Not because the war was won. Wars had been won by everyone before, and victory didn't always matter much. The difference was what they asked for in victory, because a species that had spent 10,000 years studying every way of waging war looked at the moment when it had leverage over something huge, old, and powerful, and wrote 3 lines. The third, the most important one. Anyone who wants to ask the question gets the opportunity to ask it. The galaxy was going to figure out what that meant for a very long time. Sophia didn't know any of that specifically. She was 16 years old, and she stood on the roof, watching the sunrise, holding a phone with her father's message on the screen. She knew her father was coming home. For the moment, that was the whole world, and it was enough.